to be saying less is a bore. They wanted to have more fun. They wanted a more playful approach to architecture. So the building on the left with the big pediments on top, that is an example of postmodern architecture. And it's a playful reference to that architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. Those triangles are called pediments. They might remind you of architecture in ancient Greece, like the Parthenon. And on the sides, the cladding is glass, but there's also a white material. That's Portuguese royal white granite in the shape of columns. So again, another reference to the classical architecture world. The architect who designed this building is Catalan. He's from Spain. His name is Ricardo Bofill, and he believes in architecture as theater. He wants to take a more playful, a more theatrical approach to architecture. Now here comes our Art Deco building, our first Art Deco on the tour. On the left at about the 10 o'clock mark is a building the color of sand, and it's shaped like an armchair. It has a back and two arms. This is the LaSalle Wacker building, completed in 1930, and it was designed by Holabird and Root, and also by Robori and Wentworth. And this building is Art Deco. What makes it Art Deco? Well, it draws your eye up to something fancy on the top. You may notice yourself looking upward when you see this building. That's because of those vertical lines. It also has very flat ornamentation. So neoclassical has three-dimensional ornamentation, those big urns and so forth. The ornamentation on an Art Deco building tends to be flat. And why is it in the shape of an armchair? Well, in the early 1920s, Chicago passed an ordinance that said if you build above a certain height, your building needs to get narrower as it gets taller. They didn't want tall buildings blocking the flow of natural light and air. Remember, this is back in the 1920s, 1930s, before fluorescent lighting, before air conditioning. And so one way to approach that is to build a building shaped like a chair. And this came to be known as the Chicago chair. You'll see a few more examples of it along our river cruise. Now for another example of postmodern architecture, that less is a bore, playful approach to architecture, on your left is a building with two skinny spires on top. They look almost like toothpicks. They are supported by these round elements with kind of elbows holding them up. This is a postmodern building, and it is a nod to the Chicago River, the bridges along the river, and the bridge houses. When an architect does this, it's called contextual. That means it's saying something about its context. It's talking about where it's located. So between those two elements holding up the spire, you can see there's something that looks like a little bridge. And that bridge has tall vertical windows underneath that almost look like water flowing under the bridge. So the bridge is a reference to the bridges along the Chicago River. Those things holding up those little toothpicks, those are a reference to the bridge houses on the bridges along the river. And if you look down at the base of those vertical windows, you'll see an urn. And that refers to two things. If you look to the left along Wacker Drive, you'll see big urns there. There's nothing planted in them right now, but soon there will be flowers in those. And also a nod to a famous Chicago architect named Frank Lloyd Wright. Are there any Frank Lloyd Wright fans on the boat? So Frank Lloyd Wright did not design anything along the river, so we will not see his work today. But the Chicago Architecture Center has some walking tours of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that are well worth taking. Now on your left, just past that postmodern building, is a building with a curved surface. It's kind of a blue-green color. This is 333 West Wacker. It was completed in 1983 and designed by K.P. Webb. This is also contextual. The curve of the building reflects a curve in the Chicago River. The color of the building refers to the color of the river, except on St. Patrick's Day. Has anybody been here when they dye the river green? So it's a bright Kelly green, like the floor underneath your feet. But ordinarily it's the shade of green that you see today, which is reflected in the building. Now when we get under the bridge, you're going to notice that the base of the building is clad in granite. And there are some big, round porthole-shaped windows. The reason they did that was because back in 1983, they did not have acoustical glass to deaden the sound of the L, which is Chicago's elevated train system, which runs right past the building. The L can be very, very loud when it goes on over a bridge. So they located all the mechanicals there in the base and clad that in granite, and then located the offices up above it so that the people working their offices wouldn't be hearing the L going by all day long. Now, next I want to talk about the building almost directly in front of the boat, just a little to the right. It has a big U up at the top. And as we get closer, or if you're in the bow, you'll be able to see it has a large arc at the bottom. Is there anybody here from St. Louis, Missouri? Anyone who's been to St. Louis and you've seen the famous Gateway Arch? That's a reference to the Gateway Arch, and it's also one of the world's largest rain gutters, because when rain falls against the surface of this building, the arc channels it to either side where it's used to water the landscape. This building is called River Point. It was completed in 2017, and the architects were Picard Chilton Architects. You'll also notice in front of the boat, perhaps it'll be easier to see as the boat turns, turn and go up the from the main entrance started. Well, this big red sculpture is called Constellation, and it was designed by Santiago Calatrava. Is there anyone here from Wisconsin, particularly Milwaukee, Wisconsin? So you've seen the beautiful art museum there, designed by Santiago Calatrava. So he's an architect and he's also an artist because he designed this beautiful constellation. Along the base of this building, you'll see what look like porthole windows, but they're actually exhausting because the train line that runs through the building. The train line is so wide that if you ever have high-speed trains coming into Union Station, you will not have to be able to reach this. The next building on our tour is one of my favorites, and it's the oldest building on our tour. It was completed in 1898. What we have is a big brick further strengthen the building, they inserted horizontal rods through the building. Stairs that you see the conversion is named Harry Weiss. Harry Weiss loved how to say, you can see there's a with the dramatic triangular roofs. They almost look like sailboats with porthole windows. These are the river cottages, completed in 1988 and designed by Harry Weiss. It looks to me like a wonderful place to live along the river. They have a marina, they have parking, they have elevators. They very rarely go on the market. The last one I heard about sold in 2015 for $2.5 million. Now, as we come up from under the bridge on the left, you're going to see a beige and blue building, very low, and it says East Bank Club on it. This is one of Chicago's premier fitness facilities. It was completed in the 1970s, and it didn't have this many windows. Those were added later with the renovation, because in the 1970s, nobody wanted to look out on the river. If you were on the treadmill, you didn't want to have to look at that dirty river. Back in the 1970s, it was not considered an amenity or a recreational resource the way it is today. But the renovation in the 1990s opened it up to the view of the river. And check out this townhouse on your left, the red brick townhomes. They were built in the 2020s, and they practically celebrate the river. They have windows, patios, balconies, and both sides have a river walk. That's because in the 1990s, Chicago's mayor went to San Antonio, Texas. Anyone here has been to San Antonio? They have a beautiful river. And so he helped pass an ordinance that said if you build or if you renovate on the north branch of the river, you must include a public river walk in your design. Now, back in the day, this was not the beautiful place to live that it is today. Back in the early 1940s, it was all factories, warehouses, train lines, and you can get an idea of what that looked like. If you look on your right, there's a red brick building. now they're condos, but this used to be a... Keep an eye on this property. I'm not sure what the opening date is going to be, but construction is going to start in the middle of this year, and it'll be another fun thing to do in Chicago. And that massive construction project just to the left of it is the new Bally's Casino that they're building here in Chicago. The casino is the horizontal building. At the end, there's a tower that will be a 500-room hotel. And the casino, in addition to the casino itself, is going to have restaurants and food courts and cafes and a 3,000-seat amphitheater. So just to give you an idea of how big a 3,000-seat amphitheater is, if you've heard the Chicago Symphony Orchestra perform in Orchestra Hall, that's a little bit smaller than 3,000. That's around 2,500 seats. And if you've been to the Auditorium Theater for a performance, that one's bigger. That's almost 4,000 seats. So this is right in the middle, but it's definitely in that league. So I love live music, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what performances are going to be scheduled there when it's all complete. Now, I mentioned back when we were at the East Bay Club that when it was built in the 70s, they didn't want windows looking out on the river because the river was not considered beautiful or fun. If you had been here around the late 1800s, your eyes would sting from fumes coming off the river. It was even worse. It was literally a dump. Manufacturing waste from the factories around here, they would just dump it in the river. Animal waste from the slaughterhouses way down south of here, they would dump that in the river. In fact, that part of the river is still today called Bubbly Creek. I know, because the animal carcasses would literally make the water bubble, and even human waste. The Chicago River was a gigantic sewer. It wasn't just Chicago. All cities were doing that. That's what rivers were for in those days. But the problem in Chicago is that the Chicago River emptied into Lake Michigan, which has always been Chicago's source of fresh drinking water. So people were getting sick of waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery. Sometimes 60 people a day were dying, so something had to be done. So a guy from Boston, his name was Ellis Chesbrough, he had an idea. He said, well, you pump the water off the lake using these things you built out there called intake cribs. Why don't you just build new ones further out? So they did, 2 miles from shore with tunnels to bring the fresh water back. And it worked for a while. Public health improved. However, pretty soon strong winds blew all that pollution out toward the new intake crib, and people were getting sick again. But Ellis Chesbrough had another idea. He said, well, the Chicago River empties into Lake Michigan. Why don't you reverse the flow so it flows into those western waterways? Iconic architecture, some of it we've talked about, some of it we're going to talk about on the way back. And while you enjoy that view, I want to start talking about the building on our left, shaped like a Y. It comes down almost to a point. This is 150 North Riverside Plaza. This piece of land used to be considered unbuildable because it's so narrow. But 150 North Riverside Plaza was completed in 2017 and designed by Getch Partners. They figured out how to use that narrow piece of land. They have a super strong concrete core that goes all the way down to bedrock. In fact, the core is so strong, this building could have been twice as tall. And the steel columns on this building are 40% stronger than ordinary steel. As we come out from under the bridge, you might be able to take a boat selfie on the right because our boat will be reflected in that slanted glass underneath 150 North Riverside Plaza. You might be wondering, how does such a tall, slender building not sway or even fall over? Well, buildings are built to sway. They accommodate a little bit of movement. One thing they do in this building, way at the top, you can't see it, but on the top floor there are huge tanks of water. And when the wind blows in one direction, the water sloshes in the other direction and quickly brings the building back to stability. Those are called tuned liquid dampers. And now you can hear the L going across the bridge behind us. So you can see how noisy those can be. Now after the bridge on our left, you'll see a building with big columns shaped like W's or tridents. This is the Bank of America building, completed in 2020 and designed by Getch Partners. Getch Partners says the way your building hits the ground is more important than the way it hits the sky. And I think they did a beautiful job with these columns. It opens up the view to the river and makes a big statement at the base of this building. Now, across the bridge, there's a sand-colored building. It's an Art Deco building, and this is the Civic Opera House. In fact, this is a building that tells you what its name is, because on that wide wall, it says Civic Opera Building. This was completed in October of 1929, designed by Graham Anderson Probst and White. What else happened in October of 1929? The stock market crash that led to the Great Depression. It occurred like a week or two after this building was completed. They had 8 performances of the opera Aida, and then opera went silent in Chicago. But since the 1950s, opera has been thriving, and this is the second largest opera theater in the United States. A great place to hear opera. And it's another one of those Chicago chairs, right? It's got the back and the 2 arms. Fortunately, the building had office space to rent, and that helped keep it solvent, even though the opera itself had to take a break. The Joffrey Ballet also performs in that space. The next building on the left mimics the shape of the opera building. So this is a contextual building. Sometimes there's almost a conversation going between buildings when one building will say something about its famous neighbor. I'm going to turn your attention to the right, and you're going to see some massive buildings built right on top of operating train tracks. In the 1960s, the Illinois Supreme Court decided that railroad companies could sell or lease the air rights above the tracks to builders to build buildings. And engineers had determined how exactly to do that without disrupting the flow of train traffic and without the vibrations from the trains bothering people in the offices above. So these 2 mid-century modern buildings with the dark metal and glass, they were built in the 1960s, right above operating train tracks. They were designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, and they're mid-century modern buildings, right? Very little external ornamentation. The windows are all the same size and shape. So this is what mid-century modern looked like in the 1960s. But on your right, just past these 2 dark buildings, is a light one that almost looks like a grid. It's got dark windows, but the building itself around the windows is white, and it's still mid-century modern, but this is the 1970s, so it's a little bit different. You've got that external masonry cladding. The windows are still all the same size and shape. There's very little external ornamentation. But this building, Fifth Third Center, is just a little bit of a twist on mid-century modern. Now, right next to Fifth Third Center is a lower dark building that you'll see coming into view. You can sort of see it beyond the train tracks. And it has big external X's on it. And we all remember what those external structures are called. That's external bracing. And that helps bring some of the skeleton of the building to the outside. Today, this low dark building is a fitness club. But back in the day, this was the training floor of the Chicago Stock Exchange. So I'm sure that the prisoners were very grateful that there were fewer columns on the inside so that they could better see each other and the training board. Now, the 4th building in our series, after these 2 dark mid-century modern and the white clad mid-century modern, there's a building with a sweeping curve on it. This is also designed by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, but now we're in the 1980s, and this building is contextual. The curve of the building reflects a curve of the river. The color of the glass reflects the color of the river. And when you look at things reflected in the glass, it seems to ripple, like it's on the surface of the water. So how do they do that? Well, each pane of glass is pinched in all 4 corners to give it that rippling effect. This building is the home of many things, among them the Climate Action Museum. So if you're interested in climate, sustainability, this might be an interesting place for you to visit. Now, continuing on the right past the next bridge is a massive building. This is the old post office. It's kind of sand colored. It was originally constructed, just that center part, in 1921, designed by Graham Anderson Probst and White, and then it was expanded in 1934. The 3 sections around the outside were all added. This building is so big, a highway runs through it. There are railroad tracks there. So why would Chicago, back in 1921, why would Chicago need such a massive post office? At the time it was built, it was the biggest post office in the world. Well, remember Montgomery Ward and his catalog business? He was quickly followed by Sears Roebuck, J.C. Penney, Spiegel, and Chicago became a hub of catalog fulfillment operations. Now in the 1990s, this building the post office decided it was out of date, it was antiquated. They built a new one just down the road a little bit. And this fell into disrepair. Water leaked in, wood floors buckled, mold developed, metal equipment rusted. But they went in and renovated it, and now it's some of the coolest office space in the city of Chicago. And one thing I really love is that they recycle as much as they possibly could, including over 400,000 tons of rusted metal. Today it has Chicago's largest green roof. The green roof is so big it has a running track and pickleball courts. Where won't you find pickleball courts these days? Well, they're on top of the old post office. They have a gym, they have bocce ball courts, they have lots of cool restaurants and cafes. The Chicago Architecture Center has a 2-hour walking tour of just this building. I took it a year ago, and someone did spot the fire and called it in, but he called it into the wrong location. So the fire started burning toward the river, and people thought the river would be a natural barrier, but it would stop right there. But it jumped the river. The flames were as tall as a 50-story building. There were no 50-story buildings back then, but just to give you an idea, burning embers jumped the river, and it started burning east and north up to the main branch where we started our cruise, and it jumped the river again and continued burning east and north until it ran out of things to burn and finally a little rain. The fire was so intense that it exploded trees, melted metal, and turned stone to dust. It destroyed over 70,000 buildings, and it left over 100,000 people homeless. That was the third population of Chicago at the time, and killed at least 300 people. But Chicago did not let a good crisis go to waste. They started rebuilding while the ground was still hot and the neighbors were still fire so bad was that Chicago was built largely out of wood. There were a lot of wooden houses, arrows, it looks like a waist. It gets darker, and as the stems widen, looks like shoulders, they get lighter, and that helps control temperature inside the building. This building also has a massive concrete core. In fact, the 3 stems have this concrete core inside, and it's so strong that the 2 outer stems hold up the middle stem. You can actually walk underneath it. I'll talk a little bit more about this building when we get a better view of it out at the river. Right now I want to draw your attention to the left side of the boat, and you're going to see a building coming into view in just a moment on the left as we pass these condos that are right there on the river. Look for a dark building just coming into view with kind of 3 wavy sections. To me it also almost looks like a fidget spinner with a cylinder on top. The name of this building is Lake Point Tower, and it was completed in 1968. The architects were Schipperite and Heinrich. And this is another example of buildings meant to lure people back to living in the city. And it has a fabulous views no matter which side you're on. It has its own little private garden with a duck pond, with little waterfalls. It's supposed to be a really fantastic place to live. But you might be looking at it and saying, wait a minute, that's right on the lake. It's to the east of Lakeshore Drive. And I thought you told us that there were 20 miles of open, free, and clear lakefront for public recreational use. Well, there was an ordinance that said on either side of the Chicago River where it meets the lake, there are these peninsulas that are made of fill. They're not natural land. A lot of this land here is made of fill, some of it from the Great Chicago Fire. And there was an exception where you could build harbor enhancements. And so, relying on that exception, this building went up. The ordinance has since been changed, so I don't expect to see any more buildings on the east side of Lakeshore Drive. But this one is one of my favorite buildings, and I'm glad it went up. As we get out from under the bridge, which is kind of noisy, I'm going to take a little break. your left, you can see a Ferris wheel, and that is on Navy Pier. How many people here have been to Navy Pier? So a lot of fun things to do on Navy Pier. There's a Shakespeare Theater, there's a children's museum, there are lots of restaurants, a big art exhibit is coming, Expo Chicago. There's the Flyover Chicago. Has anyone done the Flyover? It's a simulated ride through the tall buildings of Chicago. If you like thrills, I have to admit, I've done it 4 times. It can be a lot of fun. And the Ferris wheel. Navy Pier was completed in 1916, designed by Charles Frost. It was originally called Municipal Pier, and that's exactly what it was. It welcomed freight and